Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to So What, the Marketing Analytics and Insights live show. Happy Thursday. Happy last Thursday of January of 2022, which is crazy that we're already at the end of January. I started seeing end of month emails coming to my inbox, and I was like, but isn't it just January 3rd? So I don't know. Maybe it's just me. I feel like I'm sort of stuck in this limbo matrix of time right now. Um, anywho, on today's episode, we are talking about business process reengineering, what it is, how to audit your processes, and how to get started with reengineering those processes. Is it processes or processes? Does it matter?
Processes.
Processes. Processes. It's a good thing I'm not wearing a retainer. Processes. Anyway, so that's where my head's at. Chris, do you want to kick us off?
I had to deal with this a lot in graduate school. I went to Boston University, and one of the professors on staff was a guy by the name of Tom Davenport, who is a huge consulting bigwig way back in the day in the 90s. And business process reengineering was his thing, so much to the point where, like, if I had to hear about, the Xerox internal process reengineering, I was going to shoot somebody by the time I finished my master's degree. But the good news is we got beaten into our heads what this thing is and why it matters. Fundamentally, there's two ways that you can change business, right? There's evolution, which is process improvement, tuning, optimization, things like that. And then there's revolution, where you just take everything, fling it out the window, and build from the ground. It's sort of the whole burn it down and build from the ground up. Business process reengineering is the latter. It's take everything, burn it down, and start over, as opposed to something like TQM, total quality management, which is evolutionary, which is say, let's take all the processes and tune them and adjust them over time, so and make them as good as they can be. And business process reengineering is what you do when there is, again, this is another term that got beaten into our heads, when you have a paradigm shift in your industry.
Ooh.
You engage in business process reengineering, which, to be fair, like the invention of and the rollout of the smartphone was a legitimate paradigm shift, to the point where now people fundamentally do business differently with these little mobile supercomputers that we all carry around in our pockets. The internet itself, the web, was a massive paradigm shift. There are a lot of companies that love to say that their product or service is the next big thing, and it never is. Facebook's going on about Meta and the virtual reality universe, which yeah, Second Life did that 20 years ago. Guys, get off your horse. But that's what business process reengineering is you take everything that you're doing right now, you basically fling it out the window, because the environment that you're doing business in has changed so much that all of your existing processes are handicap, right? They're holding you back. That's not the way business is done anymore. And so if you stick with what you know, the tried and true, you're going to fall behind so far, so fast, that you will never keep up. Artificial intelligence, like commercial artificial intelligence, is, I think, a legitimate early paradigm shift. It's still super early, but it is one of those things where if you're trying to compete against machines for tasks that machines are better at, you're going to get your butt handed to you.
So I have a couple of questions in terms of clarifying this, and let me see if I can sort of phrase them correctly. So what you're describing is essentially what people consider those like innovative or industry disruptors. And so it disrupts it to the point where everybody has to stop what they're doing and completely sort of pivot. However, you also said that AI, which is not a new concept, people are just, it's still a buzz term. If you are following along with what AI is doing and you are evolving your business processes along the way, then do you have to completely re engineer them, or can you just continue to evolve them? I guess maybe it depends on where in that innovation adoption curve you fall.
Exactly. And it depends on your kind of business. So, like, if you are a brick and mortar store, you're going to probably approach AI evolutionarily, right? If you
Mhm.
are a digital business, you're going to approach it revolutionarily, because everything you've been doing so far is just going to get its butt handed to it by a competitor that has the AI advantage, that has just a massive advantage of data. We actually are. I should have thought of this up front. We are actually currently in the middle of a massive paradigm shift. And what we are currently in is called a global pandemic, right? It has fundamentally changed how we work, how we buy things, how we interact with others. And even after, the current situation tapers down, it the world still cannot go back. A lot of companies have said, hey, this whole not paying for real estate thing actually really kind of works out well for us. Let's keep doing that. Or hey, letting employees work from home and where they work best is actually seems like a sensible thing to do. And so that is a shift in the fundamentals, and that's what sets it apart from evolution. AI is not at the point yet where it's forcing massive large scale change, but we are getting close to that point. In some ways it already has, right? Like the news that you consume is largely driven by AI now, right? What you see on social networks and in search engines and things, the content you get is governed largely by AI. The things that you are told to buy by recommendation engines, told to watch by Netflix, told to listen to by Spotify, is all driven by AI. You no longer have a choice. You can't go back. So those things have had a paradigm shift. And if you are a new entrant into those markets and you also don't have good or better AI, you're going to get squashed.
So let's take it down to a more practical, application, something that a lot of marketers might be seeing in their own processes. And, you can help me understand if this is evolutionary or revolutionary. So you're talking about AI. So let's take, SEO, for example, and the way people, search for things. So majority of people still open up a search engine and type in, a couple of words, but there has been this shift of people who just yell at their, smart home devices. They just yell at their phone like, "Hey Google, tell me where the nearest coffee shop is that has non-dairy options." Like, people don't search when they're typing that way, but when they're speaking, it's a different way. And so the way in which you're approaching your SEO, your keywords, the phrases, the content, answering the questions, that has had to evolve, but both are still relevant. So help me understand where that falls in this.
You picked a great example, because the front end of SEO, meaning the what we as the humans do, that really has not changed. That's an evolution, how we ask questions.
Mhm.
The revolution is the language models on the back end and how Google in particular, I'm going to use Google as the headline example here, how Google processes that data. There's been one major paradigm shift in the last 3 years, and that is the BERT natural language engine that fundamentally changed how Google understands your intent of what it is you're asking. And this year, the multitask unified model is another major shift. It is a revolution, assuming it works, of how Google understands your intent and what it gives you back. Because multitask unified model now, when it takes coffee shop near me that serves non-dairy, it's going to look across media types. It's going to look at
Mhm.
videos on YouTube and the contents of images, the contents of podcasts, and understand that and return back the things that it thinks are best, regardless of media type. So from a marketer's perspective, we have to look at that and go, okay, so just tinkering with the H1 tag on our site will probably have little to no effect anymore. In not that it really has had one for very long.
Mhm.
But if we are not publishing YouTube videos, if we are not publishing podcasts, if we are not putting out metadata, if we're not publishing images, if we are not doing the structured data on our websites inside the unified model, Google will not favor us. And what's critically different is about the unified model, and this is the revolution part, is that today Google does crawl, index, rank, 3 stages. Crawl the web, pull in all the stuff, index it, try and figure out what things belong where, and then rank it. The unified model collapses crawl and index into one stage. So crawl and index happen at the same time, and it's AI enhanced. So Google has been doing this already in some markets. There was a big piece about in Alita Solis's newsletter this weekend. But Google's been starting to rewrite people's content based on the intent of the searchers, changing headlines, changing page titles and things. And the unified model is going to do much more of that. So from a marketer's perspective, we've got to expect that our content's going to get rewritten. We've got to expect that we need to have multimedia, and we need to have stuff that is relevant and fits what the customer is searching for. We almost have to get rid of the idea of keywords, right? Which is the revolution part. We've been talking about SEO keywords for 25 years. We are now at a point where Google's saying, throw out the keyword. It doesn't exist anymore. It's not going to be a relevant way for people to get information. You must now focus solely on the concept and your best understanding of the concept.
So let me pose this question to you and John. So you guys have, a really popular podcast, Marketing Over Coffee. And so again, sort of this is me just trying to wrap my head around it. A lot of people might go to marketingovercoffee.com and then start to go through the different episodes. And so historically, you would have just had to make sure that the Marketing Over Coffee website was optimized in a certain way with topics. But now me might go, hey, Google, play the latest episode of Marketing Over Coffee. Help me understand as a marketer how John, how I would need to set myself up for success to make sure that if I open my smartphone and say, hey, play the latest episode of Marketing Over Coffee, that's the result that I get. Like, what does John have to do? What do you have to do? And then what do I, as the user, have to set up on my side?
Sorry, John, were you going to say something?
I was just saying, a lot of that for us is managed on the back end. Part of the Libsyn hosting that we use is they do take care of a ton of that. That's the great part about working with a platform, is that there's that one point where once they figure out how to correctly enter you into those other indexes, and there's a service for Amazon Music, there's one for Apple. In fact, there's over 20 different formats now where when we post an episode, it actually updates 20 different services and tells them that, hey, there's, a new podcast available that you can get over there. But yeah, and then there's some overlap, just, the old SEO that you would do, now you have to make sure you're in Bing so that you can get into some Google devices. And, there's partnerships and platform agreements that go together behind the scenes to automatically move that content over. But yeah, so that's more of an evolutionary thing, and that we don't have to worry about an entirely new posting format. We just tweak the existing model, and it shows up in the new place.
So then, I as the listener, do I have to be a subscriber of the podcast in order to say so? Okay, Chris,
you are hitting on exactly the thing. Remember these?
I do.
CDs, albums, and stuff, and how they used to be coherent works. And then streaming was a paradigm shift. It broke the model of the album. Now everything is playlists and individual songs, and you as an artist are judged on your merits for every single individual song and not the album as a whole, right? That was a major paradigm shift that some artists really figured out and have succeeded wildly. Other artists have not. From a marketing perspective, what you're talking about is the same shift. You are no longer judged on the album that is the Marketing Over Coffee website or the subscription. Now we are judged and we are found by every individual atomized piece of content. So yeah, you're exactly right. You don't have to be a subscriber to Marketing Over Coffee. We are going to be found on an episode by episode level, because somebody's going to say, play me a podcast about SEO. Right. And it'll pull the multitask unified model, and even today's Google will pull up a basket of stuff. And we have to, as marketers, as content producers, we have to knock it out of the park with every single piece of content, because it is our one and only at bat. The person will not go to the website and check out everything else. They will judge us on that atomized piece of content alone. So our metadata's got to be good. Our branding's got to be good. We have thankfully, we have really good audio branding. Like, you're listening to Marketing Over Coffee in the first 3 seconds based on the sort of introductory chime notes and stuff. But audio branding is a huge thing. The same is true for everything. So people will not judge Trust Insights by the Trust Insights portfolio of our website, right? And optimizing pages. They will find a white paper we've written or a case study or a thing, and that will be the brand to them for that experience. And then they have to go and figure out, see if they like that experience, they'll go in and get more. And so it raises the bar for all of us as marketers to say every piece of content we publish has to knock it out of the park, because there's no room for mediocre content. If Google surfaces a piece of mediocre content, and that's the first and only chance we have with that audience member, they're gone, and we lose a chance of getting them back until they find some next random query. So that's the revolution part, is that we've got to get away from this idea of content monoliths and accept that content is become like playlists, and your individual pieces are going to be pulled and sampled. When we upload this episode to YouTube, one of the things that YouTube asks in the upload thing is, it says, will you allow sampling of your content? And you always check yes. And YouTube that will then allow someone else to sample like 60 seconds of our show for their own thing, right? And they don't have to ask any more permissions. So it's not even that, we as content producers have to think about, this live stream episode. We have to almost think about, are we saying something smart or dumb every single minute? Because that 60 seconds may find its way into another show as someone doing a roundup. So I guess the big paradigm shift there, and where you have to do some serious business process reengineering on your content marketing, is content has to be treated as atomic. You have to assume it's going to get broken up. You have to assume it's going to be seen out of context, and you have to assume that the user is going to take just the pieces they need. So can you produce content for SEO, for content, for social, that meets those new criteria? And that may mean, this is the re-engineering part, we have to throw away everything we think we know about creating content, spend $10,000 to hire designers and do all this stuff, and say, no, we have to change those processes. We can't evolve the existing processes. They don't work anymore.
So my head is now spinning. I'm a little overwhelmed. It makes sense. It's definitely evolving with the way that we as humans behave online, because our I can't even think of the word. Our attention span is so short that you basically have to have like sound bites and things at all times for people to glom onto to even know who you are. So I guess the second question and the second bullet point that we wanted to go over in this episode is, what processes should be audited regularly? Now that's a broad question. So we can take it again sort of back to this example of SEO and where AI is starting to evolve how SEO is done, or revolutionize, or a paradigm shift, or whatever you want to call it. Basically, AI is changing how marketers have to think about SEO. So we know that there's standard processes for keyword research. Let's just take that one for example. How would you go about auditing the process for how you're doing SEO keyword research, and evolve it to change with how AI is impacting how people are finding things?
I would start by learning how machines process language, specifically how we know Google uses the BERT model for its query parsing, for understanding inquiries. So that would be my starting point, is to say, okay, well, how does it work? How does it understand language? Does it tokenize? Is it vectorized? What are the underlying mathematical principles that make BERT work? And then from there, say, well, what from that can I learn that will help guide me for the things that I need to create? So, like, is a keyword, we've been saying this for a while, the keyword and sort of semantics is kind of out the window, right? The old joke, an SEO expert walks to a bar, pub, tavern, those semantically related terms, that's gone in a lot of ways. The way the BERT model works now is more at the sentence and paragraph and topic level. So what we would have to do is start our planning with intent. right? So what is the question that the person is asking? What are the next 3 questions that person's going to ask? And that's going to require, instead of sitting there with your SEO tool of choice and just typing in keyword combinations, that's actually require you to talk to customers, right? Listen to customers, see how they behave, ask them questions, focus. This is where stuff like, CX and DCX and, digital customer experience really matter, because you've got to have that qualitative input from customers to say, when I'm looking for a management consulting firm that focuses on change management, I'm theoretically looking for change management, but I'm really actually looking for, how do I stop my boss from making dumb decisions? And that's, sort of an HR thing. Or how do I hire people who aren't dummies? Or how do I scale my business? And so we have to anticipate what those next questions are, and then we build our content around that. In some ways, you don't actually need the keyword tool anymore. You now need a topic map, a landscape of, here's how these different concepts all cluster together. And then we build that content from that. So, like, for example, the topic of this week's show was business process reengineering, because in a keyword forecast, we picked that out because it is going to be a high volume term. It's going to peak in terms of search. But when we think about how we've approached the creation of this episode, we really focused on the implications. What are the next questions? Like, you do this really well, Katie, when you put together the So What episodes, the concept, what is it? Why is it important? How does it work? So you're already anticipating the next 3 questions when somebody types in that query. And that's how we need to change our thinking about SEO. Is not just, what keyword comes next. It's, what is the intent of the user and how do we fulfill it? And then you have to layer on Google's other stuff, like signals about expertise, authority, and trustworthiness. That gets layered on next.
Yeah, definitely little bit of head spinny, because it's interesting. I did not anticipate you saying that the place to start is to do research on the development of the Google algorithm itself. And so I guess, John, you know, how, like, how, I have no words. Like, how are you feeling about this conversation? I'm a little overwhelmed, I'll be honest.
Yeah, well, it's if you're trying to redesign SEO as your approach, I mean, that's now left to the vendors. I mean, really, that's not the kind of thing now where a frontline marketer is going to be like, okay, let me see if I can outwit Google with my content here. It's really gone too far beyond that. I don't know. For most organizations that are playing an SEO game like that, switching over to the customer experience side is usually the place to go. Of like, okay, how can we get more in the funnel at the top, or how do we get them through the transaction faster, easier, smoother? And I think, yeah, SEO, the SEO game is pretty much almost over unless you're a vendor. Like the vendors are the only one that have the understanding and the ability to kind of do that. For the frontline marketer, it's just make excellent content. I mean, that's really all that they can do, and hope that gets through. I think there is a lot of opportunity though for any kind of web property to start looking at things like, okay, do we look at other channels like online payments like Venmo and things like more text messaging as opposed to email? Do they redesign the customer experience around those sections? But yeah, I think the SEO door is pretty much slammed shut for just what you were talking about. It's like, no director of marketing is going to take 2 weeks off to try and back solve how Google cracks n-grams. It's way too much to bite off.
And that's what makes it business process re-engineering. We've got to throw out everything that we've been doing on this, because you can't evolve. It's like, go back to a century ago. How do you, if you were a horse and buggy manufacturer, you're like, oh, how can I make my horses faster? I can feed them, better hay and stuff. Meanwhile, you've got an automobile. Like, okay, you have to throw out everything you've been doing, because the world is no longer using horses. The world is now using cars. And if you've not adapted to that, you're going out of business.
So let me ask you this question then. So in that example of the horse and buggy versus the automobile, so yes, majority of people moved to an automobile away from the horse and buggy. However, couldn't you argue that the horse and buggy market found new use cases for their current product?
Oh, for sure. And they they still exist. They're just
Right.
very, very tiny niche things now. Like you can still take a horse and buggy carriage ride around Boston, pay $20 for the tourist experience and stuff, and have some guy yell at you about attractions that you could just look up on your phone. But it's sort of that experience. But the vast majority of people do not use horses and buggies.
But my point is, so you're talking about it purely for the use case of transportation, but automobiles aren't necessarily the most efficient to pull things across farmland, for example, because it's going to tear
Correct.
up the farmland. And so couldn't you then make the argument that a horse and buggy or a horse and cart is still a relevant thing, but the application of it has changed?
You could, but traditionally what typically happens is those businesses just go out of business because they don't evolve. And then somebody else buys the assets and figures out there's some other application that you can use them for. But for the most part, the big names, some do evolve, but a lot just don't make it, just like ice carving companies. There still are ice carving companies. There's like this whole cottage industry of artisanal carved ice, people chipping away glacial ice and stuff like that, and selling it in like $12 ice cubes to bars. And there still is a calling for that. It's just not a very large calling, and it's very artisanal. But when you look at companies that successfully pivot, they successfully pivot because they just fling everything out the window and say, we're not doing it that way anymore. One of my favorite companies, Apple, has managed to fling everything out the window several times, right? They in the beginning was the personal computer, and then there was the graphical user interface. Like, no, we're just throwing away the old computers. We're not doing it that way anymore. And then came along the smartphone and the tablet and the smartwatch and things. They were never first on any of those things, right? They were never first, but they were the best at it because they re-engineered their processes and said, we're just not doing it that way anymore. We've got a brand new way of doing it. Whereas you take a company that doesn't pivot as well, and apologies to them because I'm one of the champions, but IBM has struggled for 30 years to pivot to new realities, and they've consistently been a little on the late side, and their offerings take a long time to get up to speed. And IBM should have been up there with Google and Amazon, in being one of the dominant forces of the new economy, and they're not.
Yeah, well, that creates an interesting question too, and I'd be interested in what you guys have seen with that as far as re-engineering, not being able to be done by mainline mature businesses. I mean, a lot of times I see that it's somebody does a spin-off. You either create another division, and oftentimes you even put them in another building, different chain of command, because it just can't be pulled off by the existing business. Like they're too caught in the weeds and invested in the current process to be able to burn it down and start from scratch.
That's exactly what Apple did, right? The Macintosh team was literally the pirate team. They had their own building, their own culture and everything. But the thing that made that work, and the reason why Apple's kind of stagnated a lot in the last few years, is because their leadership isn't the same, right? Tim Cook, as a CEO, is an exceptional operations person. He is the business process evolution guy. He will fine tune a process and make it sing. He's not Steve Jobs. He's not F it all. Let's burn it all down and do something completely new. That was some of the brilliance behind the way Steve Jobs does things. And Katie, you can speak to this for sure, but leadership is what drives that.
No, it's true, and that's where we always come back to. It's that change management process. It's whether or not you can get people on board. And so we work with a few enterprise size organizations, and they're the ones that have the hardest time with this revolutionary change, let alone any sort of evolutionary change, because an evolutionary change means that there is a clear and existing process to start with. And a lot of times, like 10 times out of 10, that's not the case because everything is so siloed and nobody knows who owns what. So you can't even establish a process to start with, let alone evolve it. And then if you want to, in the words of Chris, burn it down and start over, well, that's a top-down initiative. That's not a bottom-up initiative. You probably have, a lot of team members who are totally on board, but unless the stakeholders and decision makers are also comfortable with that, it's not going to happen. We were talking about that in a smaller scale on the podcast this week about analytics amnesty, which is essentially that sort of same idea of like, okay, as of this day, you cut over and everything that happened in the past doesn't matter. This is the new world order, and you're either on board or you're not. And the thing that prevents that from happening are the people. You can write all the process you want. You can have the latest and greatest cutting edge platforms, but unless you get the people, unironically, it's my middle finger, unless you get the people on board, not only on board, but also the consistency of the buy-in, then it's never going to happen. It doesn't matter. So, Steve Jobs is an interesting yet unicorn example of someone who had the authority to say, all right, you over here, you just sort of like keep doing what you're doing. I'm just going to spin up this whole other thing over here. And you two just like, once I get this going, this is going to stop over here. There's not a lot of companies that feel comfortable with that level of risk, because there is a lot of risk involved, because it's a big financial investment. And if it doesn't work, then that's all sunk costs.
Yep. And there's a lot, if you do it, one of the reasons why consulting firms have something of a bad name is because if you do business process reengineering, if you really are going to do it, you're going to end up giving a lot of people pink slips, because they're not going to want to adapt to the new reality. And you're like, no, this is the direction we're going, and you don't fit in anymore. We don't need your skills anymore. You may be the best, horse groomsman in the entire company, but we're not going to have horses anymore.
Well, and that's why, one of the things I know you, Chris, talk about is always learning and growing and staying on top of what's next. And so, let's say, Chris, you came to me and said, okay, Katie, you may be the best at grooming our horses, but we're not going to have horses anymore. That's my opportunity to say to you, that's okay. I just learned how to rebuild a car engine, so I'm still valuable. So, yeah, I can let go of the horse grooming because I've been staying on top of what's going on. So I can still work for you and the direction that you're moving in. And so, just as much as it's on leadership to make those decisions of where the company's going, they need to share that vision and transparency with the rest of the company, the team, so that the employees are then responsible for professional development and making sure they're keeping up with the direction so that, they have their jobs.
And some of that is on the employees too. I mean, if I think back over my career, I started as an IT guy and I threw that out, right? And I became a sort of a analytics person. I threw that out, became a marketing technology person, threw that out, became a data science person, right? And I don't know what I'm going to end up throwing out next, but each time has been such a big pivot that it's no longer the same career. It's no longer the same titles, and it has not been a smooth evolution. It's been a lot of throw it out and do something different. It is incumbent upon each of us individually to look at our career paths and say, is the world changing and are we changing with it, right? Like you see right now, artificial intelligence is a big thing. It's impacting every aspect of marketing. If it is not in some way infused in the work you're doing, you've got a bullseye on your back, right? We see content atomization and multimedia content creation has obviously been the thing for 10 years now. Anybody who's got some gray hair remembers when Netflix was a company that shipped you discs in the mail, right? And that has not done that in a really long time because they totally pivoted into streaming video and original content. If you are a marketer and you don't have the ability to create video or to create audio or do illustrations or something, you've got a bullseye on your back. And so as much as there is business process reengineering for the organization, there really is career reengineering for the individual, and not enough people are thinking about that.
So that is essentially the point that I was making, is that the responsibility is on leadership, but also on the employees to be the ones keeping up to date. Now, I can give you, you guys work with me every day, and you know that I'm technologically, I have the right aptitude, but I don't use it all the time. And so I understand it. I don't necessarily use it. So like, I was just sort of saying today, I signed on to Discord for the first time, and it's an overwhelming experience, and it's going to take a little while. I signed on for TikTok. It's an overwhelming experience. It's going to take a little while, but my dog is yelling in the background, but this is me taking responsibility, trying to keep up with these things, because I know if I don't, I cannot effectively help lead the company in the right direction. And so that's me taking my personal responsibility. I don't want to do it, but I know that it's necessary.
Yeah, it is
It's
crazy
true.
too, because there's been so much churn in that, you'll have 10 things come down the pipe, and probably 6 of them you really don't need to worry about because they're going to be dead, before the next cycle is up. So it's kind of constantly a struggle to know what's going to be, the next Facebook and what's going to be the next Beanie Babies.
Come on, John. You're not going to roll out our Clubhouse channel?
I've got Clubhouse. It's going to be huge. That I'll be promoting it on Plurk, so you can follow me over there.
You want to join my MySpace? I have a live journal now.
We've got a lot of stuff going. It's going to be huge. And so pick up our NFT coin for this session today. It's going to be huge.
But I think,
I do have a coin.
That's sort of the thing, though. So we're fortunate, Chris, that you are someone who is constantly curious about the next thing. And so I pay attention to the things that stay consistent, that you consistently talk about. And that's where I know I need to start exploring what those things are. And that's how I manage my expectations of how much technology I need to keep up with is, you're going to try everything. You're going to look at everything that's out there and try it at least once. But the things that stick around are the things that I will then start to pay attention to.
And I think that's an important part of business process reengineering conceptually, both as as a consulting firm and as an organization, is looking at people and the kind of the roles they fill. Who are your early adopters? Who are your later early adopters? Who are your middle of the pack? Who are your laggards and stuff like that? And if you diagram out the sort of the org chart of your organization, putting people on that axis, and you find your organization leans very heavily towards laggard or late adopter, you know that you're gonna have a big change management problem because everybody's on the left-hand side of the bell curve. If you've got a good distribution, then you can say, okay, from a consulting perspective, you'll be able to make change. It'll be tough, but you'll be able to make change. If you have a lot of people who are leaning on the right-hand side, that are early adopter, beta tester, stuff like that, it might be easier to get change to go through because you have more people who are more accepting of change because they're constantly dealing with it. They're the beta testers are like, oh yeah, the button was over there yesterday, now it's over here, and all everything's been broken. They're like they're the folks who, instead of yelling who moved my cheese, they're like playing the game, where's my cheese today? If your organization is like that, you're going to have an easier time with change management. So it's that concept of who is where in your org chart on a bell curve would be a really useful exercise for companies to go through when they approach business process reengineering. Where do you lean on the bell curve of comfort with change?
I disagree with that slightly because I feel like it's very one-dimensional.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, if you look at the three of us, I would say, Chris, you're probably early adopter. John, I would probably put you squarely in the middle, leaning more towards the early adopter, whereas I'm definitely on the laggard side of the curve. However, I am open. And so that then you have to factor in the emotional intelligence. I'm open to change. I just need a little bit more time to understand it and understand why. And so I'm not someone who's necessarily going to dive in and start testing the new thing. I need to spend a little bit of time thinking about how would we use this? What is the application? Is there a so what here? And so I think that yes, the adoption bell curve is important, but it's one dimensional. So you need to factor in other pieces to that as well.
Stay tuned for the Trust Insights adoption quiz on our website.
All right, John, that's your to-do for this week.
Yeah, right. To run with it. But how do you guys feel about that? Because that is another thing. I have seen it done different ways. On one side, there's kind of the announcement that, yeah, we're going to do reengineering. And on the other, I've seen management take a team and say, okay, you guys go off and figure this out, but we're not even going to tell the rest of the org that we're looking or doing this project until we know either like there's a there or we don't want everybody to just get excited about losing their jobs when we don't even know if anything's going to happen. Is that have you guys seen that play out, and any tips on how to deal with that?
Both approaches can work. It's just a matter of dealing with the consequences and the fallout. And so if you're in the first scenario where you're like, hey, we're going to do this thing, then the consequences of that are you're going to have some people who get on board and some people who either walk away or are asked to walk away. And so as long as you're okay with that, then that approach can absolutely work. And that I've been at companies where that has been the approach, and it is very painful, but you're sort of in that mindset as the employee of like, okay, I can either get on board and do this and, go along for the ride, or I can just be like, this is not my jam. In the other scenario where you have, like a tiger team of people who are trying to figure it out and then roll it out to the company, those tend to, I mean, both sides of the equation are painful. It's just a matter of, how much buy-in do you want to get from people? So when you have a smaller committee who then rolls it out, you tend to get a little bit more buy-in because it's not so sudden and it feels like more people can collaborate and get engaged versus just a top-down, this is what we're doing, get on board or walk.
It depends on the external forcing function too. So back in 2008, early 2009, I was working in financial services at a company that did federal student loans. And that year, Barack Obama was elected to the presidency, and one of the things that was in his platform was bringing federal student loans back into the Department of Education. The company I worked for, 85% of its revenue came from reselling federal student loans. And so we basically had 65 days to come up with a completely new business model or lose 85% of our revenue and just close the doors forever. And so we had to pivot really, really, really fast. It was an all hands on deck, and we had no choice. We had zero vote in the matter. It was going to happen. And we did. We successfully pivoted. We moved into a bunch of new product lines and things. And it was very, very painful. I mean, it was basically, every night was a late night for 2.5 months, redoing all of our systems, redoing all of our websites, changing what we marketed and things. And we survived. We were not nearly as profitable as we had been. Arguably, it was morally better because we were just, we stopped selling nearly as many people into debt as we were used to. But it was a wholesale, like you had no choice. Everybody had to get on board because the business would disappear otherwise.
So as we've been talking about this for almost 45 minutes, it sounds like there's a few takeaways. One is you as an individual, one of your responsibilities is to, within your industry, try your best to stay up to date on the latest and greatest technologies, innovations, processes in which other companies that are competitor to you are doing things, and try to see how that will impact your daily life. And are there things you can learn from that and start to apply to your company? What are some of the other key takeaways, guys?
If you're talking about business process reengineering, you're talking about revolution. So it is not iterative. It is not, slow and steady. It is, you are breaking stuff and starting over. And so if you're working with any kind of consulting firm stuff, and they're saying that they're doing business process reengineering and things are not getting thrown out the window wholesale, they're not doing business process reengineering. They're doing something else. So just know what it is that you've bought. And I think, Katie, the biggest point though is what you were hinting at first, which is know what's going on outside of your day to day. Know what the big changes are on the horizon, and be ready to adapt to it, because sometimes change happens really slow and sometimes change happens really, really fast. And if you're not aware of what's happening, and we see this all the time when we talk to people who are in marketing, like, oh yeah, I don't have time for professional development, then you're toast, because at some point something's going to come along, it's just going to sink your ship.
I would say to that, even have your processes documented at all so that you know what needs to change. John, what do you think?
Yeah, I think the big idea is understand that if you think there's opportunity out there that you want to go grab, then when you re-engineer, it has to be a separate team. And if it's something that the market is forcing upon you, then you can re-engineer within the existing org. And you really kind of have to obey those, because it doesn't work the other way around. If the market itself is taking a shift and you create an outside team to do it that has no experience, they're going to crash and burn. And if you're going after something new that's huge and high risk, the existing org is going to have no interest in, leaving the current safe bureaucracy. And so make sure you've got the right approach for how you put that to work, or otherwise you're going to come up short.
Yep. It works. I think that's a good place to stop it. So if you got questions and stuff, pop on of it. We'll share our links to our Slack group and stuff in just a minute. But thanks for tuning in today, and we'll talk to you soon. Take care.